Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Echoes of War. I'm Craig from the Pacific War Channel, joined here by my co-host Garav. How are you?
Hey Greg, great to be here, and we have a really special guest speaker for our upcoming series.
Yes, please introduce yourself, Mr. Dan.
Yep, Mr. Dan, PhD. I don't like Dr. Dan; it's a bit too ostentatious, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm
I...
just gonna call you doctor all the time.
but yeah, I did a PhD in classics at King's College London, writing a thesis on ancient Greek history, particularly Athenian political and social history of a factionalism and civil war during the Peloponnesian War. So yeah, pleasure to be here, and hope everyone's having a nice weekend. Because it's the weekend while we're recording.
My,
Yeah, it's
my,
a
the mind should be also mentioned that we are alma maters and big drinking friends.
Yeah.
of course goes hand in hand with any history, and this is a big blast to the past for me because before I was the Pacific War Channel, I was a general history channel, and my first episodes actually did cover things like the Ionian Revolt, which we'll be talking about today, as well as I should talk Alexander the Great a bit, and a lot of people didn't like that. So yeah, there was that.
I
But
think it's sorry. I was just gonna say the best friends you make are those who love history and you're drunk.
yeah, in my
Absolutely.
experience.
I think that's what happened to us actually.
Happens the majority of academic conferences.
But before we jump into it, I just want to say to my audience, if you'd like to further support the channel, please consider checking out the YouTube membership or the Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War Channel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. But without further ado, Dan, please, why don't you crack open this story that I don't think a lot of people know. I think a lot of people know about the famous, the Battle of
Yeah.
Thermopylae, the Battle 300, but they don't know where it all started. So, yeah.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add this is a start of a four-part series that we're
Yes,
doing on the entire Greco-Persian Wars. And
of course.
Craig, as you rightly said, the battles of Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea, they all take center stage. But very few people even talk about why did the Persians even just want to invade, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
this is setting the stage.
Yeah. This is sort of the first open conflict between the independent Greeks and the Persians. They have found themselves previously on opposing sides of war because the Lydian king Croesus, during his conflict with the Persians, he had actually vassalized all of the Ionian Greek cities. So this isn't the first conflict between the Greeks and the Persians, but it is the sort of first time it's an independent Greek force fighting the Persian Empire, which is quite significant.
I just have a question, if you don't mind.
Yeah,
Since this is called the Ionian Revolt because they are
yeah,
from Ionia
yeah,
on Asia Minor, right?
yeah.
And I want to know what is the difference between the Ionians and the Dorians, right? Because they were like two groups of the
Okay,
Greeks. And if I remember correctly, Spartans were Dorians,
yeah,
but the Athenians were the
yeah.
Ionians.
So this is actually it's a very interesting sort of thorny topic among ancient historians because the whole idea of the Dorians that the Dorians are the interlopers who then enter Greece during the sort of Greek Dark Age prior to the Archaic period. However, there's no actual archaeological evidence of the Dorian invasion actually happening. So this whole Dorian and Ionian divide, it plays a pretty big part, as we'll see, in the way the Greeks identify themselves and group themselves into different blocks. And the ancient Greeks actually really love forming little groups and then competing with one another. But yeah,
Typical backstabbing
yeah,
day in ancient Greeks. Could you
you'll
maybe
see.
give a Could you maybe give, like I did mention Athens and Sparta, right, as two prominent members, one of the Ionians and one of the Dorians. Could you just mention maybe a couple of other major city states that would be like, just maybe a couple on each in the Ionian and Dorian side?
Yeah. So the main instigator of the revolt is a city by the name of Miletus. It is on the Ionian mainland. However, it obviously has access to the sea, and it's an interesting city because it actually becomes the scapegoat for the Ionian revolt and all of the conflicts that follow. There's even a sort of in the literary sources. There's also supposedly a Delphic oracle, which declares Miletus an evil city and the sort of creator of evils, just a bad city, basically. And
Bribing the Pythia always has its perks.
yeah, and the thing is, no one really knows where this oracle came from, and it's not even sort of mentioned during the actual account of the revolt. It's sort of a sort of tangent where the Argives, inhabitants of the city of Argos in the Peloponnese, they ask for an oracle, and then the oracle mentions how Miletus is an evil city. But rather interestingly, they don't say if the Milesians are evil people, which I think is quite significant, because scapegoating an entire collective people for being evil and sort of being to blame for the entire Persian Wars and all the bloodshed that follows, maybe a bit too far. Just blame the city as an institution, which
So,
happens to include all the citizens of Miletus.
you could destroy the city, salt it, and all is forgiven.
Yeah. Although we're going to see what happens to the city of Miletus, and it isn't pretty. But they don't actually end up salting. The Persians don't end up salting the city. That's a myth about the third war of Rome against Carthage.
I know, it's just very popular because
Yeah.
I remember during my studies, I would actually like end my notes with Carthago delando est. So, yep, I'm doing asset pricing, and at the last, I have Carthago delando est written.
I can actually say sort of a few more things about Miletus. At this point in its history, Miletus is sort of it's an affluent city, but it's a major. It is a sort of major sort of power in Ionia, but it isn't a sort of power that can project across the Aegean. It sort of needs external support in order to wage a sort of major military overseas campaign. And their arch rival is actually Samos, an island just off the coast of the mainland. And Samos is one of the largest cities in Ionia and remains a pretty respectable power even into the 5th century after the Persian Wars.
Would
They,
it be fair to say, like the power these cities have, it's not like, say, how affluent or the power projection Athens had, but it could somewhat be like, during the Second Peloponnesian War, having other, like, the smaller city states, like maybe a
yeah.
Thebes or something in comparison.
So this is actually a point I wanted to raise pretty early in the episode, is that the Athens and the Sparta that you see in this conflict are not the Athens and Sparta you see in the later 5th century. These are not city-states that have the capacity to project so much power as they did during the sort of Peloponnesian War, or even the sort of concluding stages of the Persian War. All of these cities are at roughly equal parity with one another. Athens has an advantage because Attica is massive and they somehow managed to sort of concentrate all of the power of all of the different subsections of Attica into the central region, into the central city of Athens. And likewise, Sparta has the Peloponnesian League, which is both a source of power and also a bit of a hindrance because they're never in fully control of this league and sort of getting everyone to agree on something, especially Greeks, is like herding cats. And Sparta is also sort of in the early. So Sparta is also occupying the territory of Messenia in the Peloponnese, which is full of helots who are doing all the manual labor for them. So they're constantly having to be on watch in case of a helot revolt. Furthermore, the sort of conflict between Athens and Sparta right now, there has already kicked off, where the Spartans attempted to institute an oligarchy in the city of Athens. The Athenians revolted, established democracy. We can go into that maybe later, But there is an ongoing conflict, which the Spartans did get their butts kicked, and so Athens currently is in a state of pretty decent confidence. They're already at war with Persia, actually, because the Athenian tyrant Hippias, after being ousted in Athens, he then goes around Greece trying to rally support, but then he goes to Persia in order for all the gold and all the soldiers to retake his city. The Persians, in fact, demand that the Athenians restore Hippias to his former title, but they refuse, and so Athens is technically in a state of revolt against the Persian Empire already. But that's sort of the state of affairs on mainland Greece. Athens is recently democratic, unified, won a string of military victories, feeling relatively confident, and Sparta is in a state of having lost a conflict of Athens, but the ruling dynasty, the ruler of Sparta, Cleomenes, is also in a pretty insecure political situation because his only heir during the revolt is, I believe, a 10-year-old daughter by the name of Gorgo, and thus his succession isn't quite secure. So this is not a sort of state of affairs where Sparta is feeling particularly adventurous.
So how did the conflict like start to, come about in Ionia itself?
So the conflict actually begins in Naxos, which is situated in the central Aegean. It's between Ionia, mainland Greece, and Crete. It's in that sort of archipelago of islands called the Cyclades. And what happens is, during the factionalism that usually impacts Greek cities, several Naxian noblemen end up getting driven out as part of a sort of democratic revolution. And these Naxian exiles end up in Miletus, where they connect with our first protagonist of the tale, a fellow by the name of Aristagoras, who is currently serving as the sort of quasi-tyrant of Miletus. He's actually a deputy of his father-in-law, a man named Histiaeus, who's currently serving as an advisor in the Persian court. Now, what happens is these Naxian noblemen, they come to Aristagoras, and he says, and they basically say, hey, we want you to, if you can help us restore our positions, and we will be loyal to Persia, and we'll be allies of you. Plus, we have loads of money that you might be interested in if you
All
take back Naxos.
it's not a bribe, right? It's a donation.
It's so what happens. So Greek cities, Greek exiles love doing this, where usually if you're being driven out of a city, you've sequestered quite a lot of money that you've earned through your, let's say public service, and you show all this money to a potential benefactor or someone who can help you return home and restore your regime. And so this sort of entices them to think, oh wow, like that's quite a lot of money these exiles have. We should perhaps invade this place because they must have more. They must have more money where that came from. And so it's a pretty enticing thing to do. It actually does happen. This is actually a very sort of similar start to the Sicilian expedition during the Peloponnesian War, where a Greek city actually brings basically their entire treasury over to Athens and says, yep, this is only a small fraction of our riches. Please come invade Sicily, and there's so much more that you can find here.
That's amazing.
But yeah, it's one of those sort of diplomatic tricks that the Greeks at least like to pull according to the histories. But this works. Aristagoras says, you know what, I agree to this expedition, but I do have to get authorization from the Persian satrap, who's basically a regional governor. And the satrap is a man by the name of Artaphernes, who is a relative of the current king of Persia, Darius I.
I
So
just preferred his Age of Empires portrait and not the actual one. So, but I think Artaphornis was not in high favor, like very high favor with the Great King, right? At this time.
he's the satrap of Sardis. So he's basically just a regional governor on the western fringe of the Persian Empire. He is he is within the sort of royal family, as it were, but it's sort of unclear how much influence he actually has over the king, especially compared to a figure like Histiaeus, the current actual tyrant of Miletus, who is sort of in favor and is sort of a trusted advisor of Darius. But yeah, Darius gives his royal assent for this expedition to take place, and Artaphernes is actually very generous because he's looking at Naxos and he sees a springboard in which to exert control over the Aegean on behalf of the Persian Empire due to Naxos's central position in in the Aegean Sea. And so he's basically looking at this and seeing drachma signs or like Persian Darek signs are going off in his eyes. So he actually
I'm
doubles.
imagining the cartoon image, right?
Yeah,
When the eyes go in the
yeah,
mouth.
yeah, absolutely. And so he actually doubles the number of ships that the Persians and send to Naxos. And it's never a
How
good
big was it?
sign.
How big was the invasion force?
Um,
Because I read like the king also sent several squadrons.
yeah. So they send a pretty substantial army, and so the Persians send a fleet of 200 ships over to Naxos and about 8,000 soldiers, with the expectation that the Naxians, upon seeing this armada and all of these Persian soldiers, will just open the gates and let back the Naxian exiles. And so they're not expecting a very sort of big fight, let's say. The problem is that a Persian commander by the name of Megabates, who's also a member of the royal house, he's also sent to command the Persian forces. And there seems to be a bit of a mix-up because, or at least tension, some ambiguity, which is never a good sign for the hierarchy of a military expedition. Because nominally Aristagoras, the architect of this venture, he's supposed to be an overall commander. However, Megabates is a member of the royal house. He's a member of the Achaemenid family. Close, he's connected to the great King Darius. He's expecting a more sort of. He's expecting to be a bit higher ranking than Aristagoras.
So they've never really clearly established who's like overall commander, and egos
Yeah,
clash.
yeah. This really goes sort of bites them because during an inspection of the fleet at the island of Chios, which is also a large island in Ionia, it turns out that one of the Ionian captains doesn't set a watch, and Megabates takes it upon himself to punish him, and he punishes him in the very creative way of sticking his head basically through the sort of oar hole of one of the triremes and tying him up over there. Aristagoras gets wind of this because the person being tied up is actually one of his mates, so he demands that Megabates releases him, and when Megabates refuses, he unties him himself and rebukes him by saying, "But you, what have you to do with these matters? Did not Artaphernes send you to obey me and to sail wherever I bid you? Why are you so meddlesome?" So he's clearly under the impression that he's an overall command of the expedition, to the extent that he actually rebukes a member of the Persian royal family, albeit a bit of a minor royal, but it's a bold move indeed.
Mm, could be pretty detrimental for your career efforts, I guess.
Yeah, you might want to take this into consideration as the story goes
This
on.
I
Mega,
just want to say this kind of sounds like how the Venetians and Genoans are fighting before the Battle of Lepanto.
yeah,
It really
it,
feels something like that.
yeah. It's actually a point that I want to make about the overall account of the Ionian Revolt and to an extent of the Persian Wars. Herodotus is writing in the sort of 5th century, and 5th century Greeks, and just Greeks throughout their history, are really fascinated by internal factionalism and conflict. They really dislike it. They really hate strife. The goddess Eris, strife, is not a good goddess. You don't want to like say prayers to her for her to be on your side. You don't want to like be offering your best cow or whatever. But they are also simultaneously fascinated by human conflict and conflict within sort of cohesive sort of internal bodies. And so this is going to be sort of a recurring theme of disunity and internal conflicts throughout Herodotus's account. But Megabates is like super angry at this. And so what he does, according to Herodotus, is that he sends a message over to the Naxians warning of them of the impending Persian attack. This this is
Wow, that's it.
it's a pretty extraordinary act. Whether or not this actually happened, I do have some questions because if the Persians arrive and the Naxians have already figured it out and they've prepared defenses and the expedition fails, Megabates' name is also on this campaign as well. So whether he'd sort of betray his own forces and commit to doing this action. It's a bit unclear, but people do crazy things when they're absolutely raging. So it's not impossible, but I do have my skepticisms about this. But all in all, the campaign is a failure because the Naxians already know they're coming. They shut the gates the moment these exiles come back. There's clearly no public support for the restoration of the previous regime, and so the
I
Persian
guess
expedition,
the exiles were definitely exiles.
yeah, the exiles remain exiles, and the great Persian armament returns back to Ionia. And this is where Aristagoras' mind begins to start acting in overdrive, because he's just pissed off he's just angered a Persian minor royal. He's also wasted about 200 ships and all of the money needed to pay for them and all the soldiers from Artaphernes, promising an easy fight, which proceeded not to happen.
So he's pissed off two members of the royal court, pretty
Yeah.
much.
So his political situation right now is extremely precarious because it's unclear whether the Persians, once word reaches to Susa and the Great King hears about this, whether he's going to remain in control of Miletus. So he hatches a scheme, supposedly, according to Herodotus. He gathers everyone in his faction into a meeting in Miletus, and they begin discussing a revolt against Persian rule. However, Miletus isn't strong enough to fight Persia all by itself. It does need external help from all of the other Ionian cities, and also it would also help to get the mainland Greeks involved. While they're debating the merits of whether to revolt or not, a messenger comes running into the room, and the messenger claims to be from the tyrant of Miletus, Histiaeus himself, Aristagoras' father-in-law, all the way from Susa. And rather interestingly, the messenger bids him to give his head a bit of a shave because he's got a bit of a mullet that he could do with a haircut. They shave this guy's head, and what do you know? It's a coded message from Histiaeus telling them to begin a revolt. This is a pretty interesting story because the idea is that Histiaeus shaved this guy's head. He wasn't bald originally. He shaved his head for like once the first time. Tattooed a coded message, bidding his city to revolt, and basically waited, hiding this guy in the Persian court for probably a few months, waiting for the hair to grow back, and then sends him all the way back to Miletus. And at the very perfect moment when when Aristagoras is considering a revolt, this guy appears. They shave his head. What do you know? Histiaeus has bid them to revolt. So it seems a little bit convenient, but it's an interesting story nonetheless. So, with this decided, Aristagoras instigates the Ionian Revolt, and so he convinces the Milesians to rise up against the Persians, and he starts quickly going around and securing the Ionian generals who had previously served on the Naxian campaign, as well as ousting all of the tyrants in Ionia, in the Ionian cities, because all of these tyrants had been maintaining their positions by sort of supporting the Persians. They oust the tyrants. Herodotus rather amusingly says that Aristagoras pretends to institute democracy in all of the Ionian cities.
Freedom and liberation, you know, the
Although,
difficult
to,
language.
although to be fair, to Aristagoras, as you'll see, he does end up acquiring a very bad reputation. However, the actual text does say he ousted these tyrants. They were either expelled or the Ionian populations of each city then killed the tyrants who had been ruling them. But he never actually says what replaced them, other than he pretended to institute democracy. And given that he doesn't actually pick anyone to replace them, I would say it's a pretty fair assumption that some form of quasi-democracy or some hybrid regime combining both council, oligarchic rule, and democratic rule ends up arising. Because hybrid regimes do tend to be the sort of norm in the Greek world, at least according to Aristotle. But now at this point, all of Ionia is an outright revolt. But even with the entire region in revolt, they do still need external help. So Aristagoras gets on a ship and sails to the mainland in order to court the Greek cities of the mainland, namely Sparta and Athens. He comes to Athens and he presents his case to the king Cleomenes. He sort of says the Persians are an easy mark. They don't even wear bronze armor. They're walking around in these robes of these spears and these bows, and you'll definitely be able to take them. And he brings out this massive bronze map of the sort of known world, and he's pointing to different regions in Anatolia. So Lydia, you have loads of riches there. Or Caria, think of all of the harvests and think of all of the sort of how many goats you'll be able to get, able to
How
loot
many you could
from all
sacrifice?
these. Yeah, think about all of the loot you can get from Asia, and it's all guarded by these men who don't even wear bronze armor like you people. So should be a
I guess
pretty easy
this
fight.
the image I think shows what he wants to portray, right?
Yeah.
And Cleomenes' reaction when he's explained how far a distance
Yeah.
these are.
Cleomenes basically
Honestly,
says,
I
give me
just
3 days to think this over. 3 days, fair enough. And clearly he's thinking in his mind, okay, what are the necessary logistical factors, and consulting with his advisors. 3 days passes, and he calls back Aristagoras and he asks, by the way, how far away are these sort of wealthy cities occupied by men in robes? How far are they away from the sea? And he says, as Herodotus says, he made the mistake of being honest for the first time in his life. And he gives the actual distance, and they're obviously very far away from the sea. Although I
I
will
think
say, in Aristagoras' defense, it's not that bad because at this point the Persians have built the Great King's Road, so you can easily go from the coast to inland relatively straightforwardly just by following this main, very well paved road. But but Cleomenes immediately rejects the expedition out of hand. He doesn't want anything to do with this.
I think I'll just say one thing. The way you're describing Aristogoras, no wonder the Age of Empires campaign Glory for Battle for Greece, he sounded so unhinged in the game commentary.
Yeah, that is the reputation you get from Herodotus's account, and I think it's an important thing of history to remember that it is a historian looking at a revolt that failed, and so he has that benefit of hindsight. And when you have hindsight, you can easily start looking for scapegoats. And as I said, a trip from the coast to an inland Persian city like Sardis is not that tenuous, depending on which roads you're using. So in Aristagoras' defense, it's not that bad, especially if you've secured the territory around the countryside, and which the Ionians end up doing because basically almost all of the western periphery of Asia comes into open rebellion. And and Aristagoras continues trying to appeal to Cleomenes. He does a little trick that ancient Greek politicians like to use, where they use supplication in an attempt to sort of convince someone to sort of take pity on them and give them help. It's sort of feigning vulnerability, and supplication is actually it's a divinely authorized thing that the Greeks do. It's where you touch the knee of a person, appealing to them. You appeal to the gods, and because the gods, particularly Zeus, are the sort of great protectors of supplicants, so you do have to take them seriously.
It's also like
However,
massaging the ego and saying
yeah,
that, oh yeah, I respect you so much. Please help me.
yeah,
You're
it's a big public act. It's the big guns of desperation, and also publicity as well, because he's sort of like appealing to them publicly, appealing to the gods, and making sure that everyone is sort of has this on their mind, that there's a record, an account that everyone can remember that he at least did this for the future. But it doesn't work. In fact, Cleomenes' 10-year-old daughter Gorgo, in fact, says, "You're very right to distrust Aristagoras, father. This guy's clearly a wrong 'un." So the Spartans are not convinced by Aristagoras. So he continues on to Athens, Sparta's rival, and also the Ionian mother city. And this is a very, very big deal because it creates a sort of generational link between the Athenians and the revolting Ionians. And funnily enough, Herodotus goes into great depth about what happens in Sparta, but he doesn't go into very great depths into what actually happens at Athens. Because speaking as an Athenian historian, the idea of setting up a military expedition, especially this is the first one of its kind in Athenian history, is a very big deal and comes with very great debate, sort of Sicilian expedition style levels of debate in Thucydides, which Herodotus omits the entire thing. You don't hear any of the speeches. All you get is it's easier to fool 30,000 Athenians than it is to fool one Spartan king. And that's basically it. He uses this as an opportunity to critique democracy. However, speaking as an Athenian historian, he only does this. First of all, you can't fit 30,000 people in the Pnyx in the Athenian assembly, so obviously this is a bit of sort of distortion on Herodotus's part. And second of all, there's so much sort of accountability and checks and process and speeches, and you have to get the general's opinion, and it's because if anyone can speak in any citizen can speak in the Athenian assembly, all of these decisions do go through a sort of high degree of rigor, as well as the fact that the council will also screen and sort of decide what's on the agenda for today, and this is obviously a very, very big issue. But nonetheless, probably because the Athenians, it's in their strategic interests in order for this band of Ionian cities to form a cohesive unit to resist the Persians, because, as I said, Athens is already at war with Persia. They don't want the Persians to come back over to Athens and then reinstall Hippias, and having this Ionian confederacy that's also in conflict with the Persians and also an Athenian ally would be a pretty strong buffer preventing Persian meddling in Athenian affairs. And second of all, it's obviously the importance of Athens as the Ionian mother city. If Athens refuses to help the Ionians, then it damages their reputation, but also would also damage their sort of military reputation and deterrence, basically. Plus, everyone loves loot, and obviously
Exactly.
he Aristagoras brings out his bronze map again and shows, oh, look how wealthy all these cities are, and so poorly defended by the men in robes and bows.
And of course, there's the added bonus of doing something the Spartans refused to do.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an opportunity to sort of acquire this strategic ally with all of these resources that the Spartans had declined. So the Athenians aren't going to. There's plenty of rationales for the Athenians to embark on this expedition, and for only the measly cost of about 20 ships as well, because this is not the great Athenian navy of the Battle of Salamis and the Peloponnesian War. 20 ships is still a significant amount considering that obviously Athens has a smaller fleet, but in the grand scheme of things, 20 ships is not that big. The Ionian cities collectively are able to field about 350 ships, so it's a pretty standard sized fleet for a sort of for a city power that's sort of beginning to take its first steps into the sort of world of Greek politics between the city-states. So the Athenians send 20 ships, and also Aristagoras manages to convince the city of Eretria to send 5 ships, and they send them on the grounds that they're paying back an ancestral debt, basically, because several generations prior, the Milesians had actually helped the Eretrians in a war known as the Lelantine War. And so because the Greeks are very much take seriously generational aid, generational allyship, hospitality, and so the Eretrians, on account of this, send 5 ships to aid the Ionians, and all of these ships arrive in Miletus, ready to kick off the rebellion. And thus Aristagoras then begins his campaign against the Persians proper. He doesn't command the force himself, he lets someone else do it, and so he remains at home while he sends everyone else to fight. And the plan is to launch a surprise attack on Sardis, which is the regional capital where Artaphernes is based, and being able to capture, potentially loot Sardis, would basically throw Persian forces into disarray at the very onset of the war. So the Greeks board their ships and sail over to the city of Ephesus, which will be their main staging ground for the campaign. Which will be the main staging ground for the campaign, and then they, through navigating some mountain paths that the Persians had left unmonitored, they actually do end up in the very outskirts of Ephesus very, very quickly, to the point where they actually catch the Persians by surprise. The Greeks charge in, overwhelm the Persian guards. They charge into the outskirts of Sardis and start pushing their way over towards the citadel and the agora where Artaphernes has sort of barricaded himself. However, during the commotion, a fire ends up being set, whether by accident or because one of the Greeks did it on purpose. You can never really know, but it doesn't really matter whether it was on accident or on purpose. A fire basically rages out of control, and because Sardis is mostly made out of wood, this puts the Greeks in a very awkward position where they're trapped between the raging fire and the rallying Persians. And so they basically see a bunch of Persian troops that look like they're rallying about to counterattack, and the Greeks beat a hasty retreat back out of the city.
So a unexpected ruse came to the Persians' aid in a way.
Yeah. Sometimes in the Persian wars, people do just get lucky, and this happens more than you'll think in the following accounts, especially the way Herodotus presents it. The Greeks basically try to make it all the way back to their ships and make it all the way back to Ephesus, which back into the safety of Ephesus's walls. However, they're also being chased down by the Persian troops, who are probably mounted because they're able to harass these Greeks and sort of keep them disorganized and eventually force them to fight in a battle where the Greeks end up getting routed off the field. It's a significant defeat. However, they didn't gather all of the hoplites of all of Ionia. It is mostly the Milesian forces as well as a few other cities. So strategically, the actual loss of men and supplies isn't serious enough to sort of kill the rebellion in its cradle. However, what did happen was the Ionians got routed in front of the Persians, their enemy. Not very good, very bad. However, even worse, they got routed in full view of their allies. So the Athenians see this, and they sort of think, well, clearly these men in the robes, they're not as weak as we've been led to believe. And Sardis was a city made of primarily out of wood, which is why it went up in flames so quickly. Which means that the Athenians also didn't really get much loot out of the entire venture in the end. And they look at Sardis and think,
is it fair to say Athenian ventures outside of the main Greek lands is never a profitable enterprise?
yeah, you should hear about the one they sent to Egypt. That one was a proper military disaster.
I thought the Sicilian one was the leader in that.
Oh, before Sicily, there is Egypt, also a sort of Athenian adventure that goes horribly wrong.
So, moral of the story: if you're Athenian, don't go out of the mainland Greece
Well,
for
to be
military
fair,
expeditions.
giant set-piece military expeditions, like giant set-piece Man United signings, do tend to be high-risk ventures, let's just say.
Are you talking about the great Anthony?
What? No, I was talking about Rasmus Højlund. Anthony's great. Absolute success. But the Athenians also recognize, because they also see Sardis, like, they are there. They can see with their own eyes that Sardis is a city made of wood, and this is this regional capital that you'd expect to get a pretty hefty amount of loot from, and it just goes up in flames. To the point where they think, you know what, maybe these cities aren't as poorly defended as we first thought, but maybe also we're not going to get as much as we thought out of these campaigns if these cities are just going to go up in flames. And it's pretty unclear who causes the fire, whether it's an Ionian who gets a bit overexcited. You know what happens, you're busy fighting and you knock over an oil lamp and everything starts going up in flames. It is the ancient world. Gaurav, you probably know about the Great Fire of Rome. No one really knows how that happens. And it could have
You
been
could also
like,
make the same almost for the Great Fire of London, I might add.
yeah, Great Fire of London, Alexander the Great burns down Persepolis, whether by purpose or by accident.
A little
But
bit of drinking.
yeah, massive
With
fires that wipe
Alexander,
out.
at least with Alexander's burning of Persepolis, you can attribute a good percentage of the likelihood to drinking.
Like great cities, even the best ones like Rome, they can just go up in smoke, like in the ancient world and in the medieval period. But they look at this and they think, you know what? I think we might have been lied to. You know, I think Aristagoras, might have misled us when he put out that bronze
Uh,
map showing all of the
I
wealthy
might just
lands
add
of
one thing.
Asia. Yeah,
I don't think anyone here had the insights of Crassus to create a fire brigade service and extort
yeah,
people.
yeah. This, and the thing is, it's the Athenian response, which doesn't really get much attention from Herodotus. Herodotus basically says that the Athenians straight up leave and never come back and refuse to fight alongside the Ionians, is that the Athenians don't stop being at war with Persia. They just stop fighting alongside the Ionians, which gives the sort of impression, and it's all part of this literary tradition, that this revolt of Ionian freedom instigated by Miletus, this evil city that originates all evils. That's the scapegoat for the entire Greco-Persian conflicts of the burning of the Athenian Acropolis, all of the lost lives, all of the enslaved Greeks. That all of this is somehow the fault of Miletus and Ionia,
And
because
not
the
the people of
Ionians,
Miletus.
yeah, because they dragged mainland Greece into a war, which, by the way, the Athenians were already at war with the Persians. So if anyone is to blame, it's technically the Athenians. I mean, the Athenians, prior to Hippias's demand, prior to the Persians' demand that they bring back Hippias, they accidentally, as a democracy, they accidentally swear fealty to Persia. They send the earth and water, thinking that it's an amazing Persian alliance that's going to help us fight the Spartans. Turns out they've just submitted as vassals to the great king. And when they refused to bring back
At least they
Hippias,
don't
it's now an
get kicked
open
out.
revolt. Yeah.
Well, they don't get
So
kicked down the well, right?
it's a rather convenient. So the Ionians and Miletus provide a very convenient scapegoat for the Athenians, even though the Athenians were the first Greeks to actually be in open war with the Persians. But nevertheless, turns out being a snake you can't defend really, really can damage one's reputation. And I'm not just saying this as a person who loves making fun of Trent Alexander-Arnold. So
So
Aristagoras
that's what you
finds
had
himself,
warned me about in
yeah,
advance.
yeah.
Thank you.
Ar- Aristagoras finds himself in a bit of a sticky situation. He's lost he's basically lost the Athenian allies that he had gone on this embassy to bring back. He had also chosen not to lead the expedition himself, and the expedition itself to Sardis was also a defeat. However, despite this, the Ionians do have a lot of luck in actually inflaming basically the entire western periphery of the Persian Empire into open rebellion. The Carians also go into revolt. The Ionians send ships over to the sort of Thracewood region around Byzantium, sort of around the area of modern-day Istanbul, and end up securing territory in the northern sort of Aegean Sea.
Uh, just for my knowledge, so it's not only Ionia, but all these provinces that we can see, right? Caria,
Yeah.
Aeolia, Troad, etc. They all have a good amount of Greek or Hellenistic influence right now, and it's quite strong.
Well,
Would you
they're
say that?
referred to as the Phoenicians in a way, I think.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
is the people that colonize this part of the Mediterranean.
Yeah. All of the sort of settlements in sort of the west, in sort of western Anatolia, a lot of these settlements are places that were previously occupied by people such as maybe the Hittites. I mean, there's the old site of Troy, but all of these are sort of quite affluent areas that have access to the sea, and thus there's a massive incentive for explorers and sort of adventurous typed people who sort of unhappy with their lot in their sort of home city. They look at this area and they see a land which has access to the sea and also is also quite fertile as well, and they think, you know what, I can build a settlement here. And so during the Archaic period, quite a lot of Greek settlements and polis city-states end up being established in, well, Ionia, but also there are all kinds of Greek colonies, such as there's one in Syria. There's also one in Egypt as well. The Greeks make it all the way there. And these colonies
Is
are
it
just
called?
really...
It's not Alexandria, I guess.
No, it isn't. It is not Alexandria. I believe it's called Naucratis, but I could be wrong. It is worth a look. Just type in Greek city in Greek colony in Egypt, and you'll probably get the right name. But yeah, these are these locuses of trade and these massive opportunities, especially because archaic Greece is not the most pleasant place to be sort of living in, especially if there's these conflict between cities, you've got the factionalism, and just being able to get out of there and found a new city, wouldn't that just be great? So you can start afresh, but also start afresh in the knowledge that you have security from your old city as well, because you obviously maintain that tie. It's
I
actually a
guess one
practice.
of the I guess it's one of the things we will discuss in the upcoming episodes when one of Themistocles' rivals also returns from exile. It's kind of on those lines you're talking about.
Psst. Hey you ever hear me talk about some great Pacific War movie or documentary like Pearl Harbor Minute by Minute over on Netflix and feel the urge to watch it for yourself? Uh-oh, you live in Japan, and your Netflix doesn't have it? Must suck to be you.
Sucks to be me right now.
Oh wow, Season 4 of Demon Slayer is out. Oh wait, I can't watch it on Canadian Netflix, but it's over on Japan Netflix? Whatever will I do?
Oh, no.
Being blocked from regional content? With private internet access, you too can watch Demon Slayer Season 4 by switching your IP address to Japan.
Yes! Hell yeah!
Why stop with Japan? With private internet access, you can change your IP address to over 84 different countries and every single US state, giving you access to region-restricted content all over the world.
Nice.
Many websites and services like Netflix are only accessible depending on your physical location, but private internet access helps you overcome these restrictions. Think about it. Without private internet access, it's like paying for a TV series and missing out on the latest season. Shots fired, Demon Slayer on Canadian Netflix.
Is that like a personal attack or something?
Ever fear people are gonna find your Google searches?
Banzai! Banzai! Banzai!
FBI, open up!
Private internet access makes sure that those Google searches remain a buried secret, as private internet access encrypts your internet access and has a no logs policy. Think you're safe with the local coffee shop's free Wi-Fi? No, you are certainly not. Private internet access gives you more privacy features than any other software, and real-time protection from malware and trackers, giving you peace of mind knowing those Google searches remain seen by you and you alone. Private internet access has a no-log policy that they've defended in court, which means they are not storing any of your browsing data. Hey, are you like me using different devices under one household? Private internet access is available on all platforms and protects an unlimited amount of devices at the same time. I personally use private internet access to unblock movies and TV series from all across the globe, and I sleep easier writing scripts for my YouTube channel and others knowing my data is secure. Look, this is a no-brainer. Sign up with my link in the description of this video to get 83% off, plus 4 months for free, so it ends up being only around $2 per month. Signing up for private internet access is risk-free. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee, and 24/7 customer support is available. So don't forget to click www.piavpn.com/the Pacific War Channel, and a big thanks to Private Internet Access for sponsoring this video.
The ancient Greek world is actually a very interesting place because there is actually quite a lot of displacement and movement of people across the Aegean, whether it be as political exiles or it's because they just see an opportunity and they take it. Basically, they establish a city on behalf of their mother city because they're able to convince the mother city because that area governs some sort of strategic interest. Like the area might be rich in timber, it might sit on a confluence of rivers or on a main road, and so it sort of improves that city's access to resources, and it's a pretty easy sell, especially if you can get enough people to sign up to sort of get on this colony. But yeah, basically a lot of the western area, the western sort of periphery of the Persian Empire goes up in the flames of rebellion. They start revolting against the Persians, and the revolt even makes it all the way to Cyprus, where Cyprus sort of declares this independent revolt. And even though the Ionians have just lost the Battle of Ephesus, the revolting Cypriots then send an embassy over to the Ionians, and they say, "Can you send aid to help us in our rebellion?" The Ionians agree because having this conflict in Cyprus ties down Persian forces and diverts the Persian fleet to the point so that they're not attacking Miletus, basically. So the Ionians send a fleet over to Cyprus, and it's very interesting that they actually sort of present themselves as speaking with a common voice. The people of Ionia, we come here to fight alongside Cyprus, basically, and
Cyprus
thus
gets invaded and counter-invaded so much during this Hellenistic era.
yeah, absolutely. Cyprus is one of those places where it's somewhat similar to Syria, where it's a pretty strategically important area, but it's not strategically powerful enough to hold back all of the greater powers who want to hold this strategic area, basically. Syria in the ancient world is also very similar to that. So you have the wars between the Ptolemies and Seleucids over Syria, the war between the Hittites and the Egyptians over Syria, and yeah, Syria, because it is this crossroads between sort of the Middle East and also Anatolia, and also it's on the road to Egypt as well. But the Cypriot revolt is being led by a man named Onesimus, and he brings in this Ionian help, and he gives them the option of, do you want to fight with us on land, or do you want to fight at sea, the sort of Persian imperial fleet, which is basically the Phoenician fleet? Do you want to fight at sea and we'll handle the fight on land, or you can help us fight on land? The Ionians say, the common voice of Ionia says that sent us as ships to fight alongside you at sea. We will leave the freedom of Cyprus to you to fight it out on land. And the Greeks actually do defeat the Phoenician fleet, and this marks the first victory, in fact, in a pitched battle between the Greeks and the Persians. For the Greeks, the Greeks managed to best the Phoenicians on the sea, leaving the forces of Cyprus to fight the Persians on land. The problem is that as I said before, there is this theme of disunity in Herodotus's accounts of particularly the Ionian Revolt, but also to an extent of the Persian Wars in general. Some of Cyprus's forces in the rebel army actually defect to Persia and turn the flank of the rebel army, even though Onesilis actually manages to kill the Persian commander. So what ends up in sort of being almost a moment of triumph where Cyprus has won its freedom ends up being a calamity for the rebellion, and Onesilis is killed during the rout. Since the Persians are able to occupy all of the cities of Cyprus, clearly drawing the Persians into a war in Cyprus where they won't be fighting the Ionians in their homeland, that plan has now failed, and so the Ionian fleet sails back home. Now, Aristagoras at this point is in a very precarious situation, even more precarious than he was when he instigated the revolt in the first place. At this point, the Milesians are starting to get a bit fed up with this guy, because his leadership hasn't really yielded any sort of strategic gains. He's lost the Athenian allies,
I wonder why.
and now the Ionians have had to evacuate Cyprus. And so at this point, he starts creating a contingency plan. And it's a contingency plan that a lot of ancient Greek elites like to do, where they'll steal a bunch of money from the city treasury and also take as much of their own wealth as possible. And they'll find a fortifiable position where they can hold up in while sending a messenger to beg for outward assistance in order to put down their own citizens. To his credit, Aristagoras doesn't actually go through with this plan. What he does do, he then leaves Miletus. And the Ionians and takes some forces to fight in the Thracewood region, to fight the natives there, and also to secure more territory for the rebellion in Thrace. And it is in this location where he meets his end. He gets killed by the Thracians, basically. So there
I
ends.
just have one question, if you don't
Yeah.
mind. See, right now we know most of the western coast of Asia Minor is up in revolt, and parts of Thrace. And is it still Artaphernus' satrap that is still the only Achaemenid forces that are fighting along with the Phoenicians, or has he been now receiving reinforcements from the Great King?
Yes, good question. During this period, Caria is also in revolt, and so the Persians actually do send troops in order to attack the Ionian cities and sort of make examples of them in order to cow them into submission. So the Persians do take the city of Clazomenae on the Ionian mainland, and they do have a number of tactical successes around the sort of peripheries of the revolt. However, during a large major expedition into Caria, the Persians end up getting ambushed, and they basically, or the entire force ends up getting wiped out, basically, in a place called Pedasus. And so because of this battle, this delays Persian military action on the ground for some time. And so you'll notice that the Ionian Revolt actually lasts 6 years, and the reason why it lasts 6 years is because the Persians end up having a major force wiped out at Pedasus and having to rebuild their army in the region. However, they are rebuilding, and they do have smaller detachments who are also sort of campaigning against the Greeks. But at this point, the majority of the fighting is being done in the sort of peripheries of the rebellion, so places like Caria, Thrace, and it's in this period of sort of strategic limbo, basically, that Histiaeus, the actual tyrant of Miletus, returns, and he attempts to sort of come back to Miletus, and he expects to be welcomed back as this hero. He was expecting everyone to have missed him, basically. However, nobody misses him. None of the Milesians want anything to do with this guy, and so he ends up wandering around the cities, trying to cobble up a force that he can used to influence the rebellion and also get a strategic win for the Ionians in order to gain some credibility that he's lost during his time of Persian captivity. However, these campaigns they end up being sort of non-issues, and thus Histiaeus' campaigns have a negligible impact on this overall situation.
Before Aristogoras really started the revolt, it was also said that the Persian court actually began to suspect Histiaeus, who, as you said, was in Susa,
Yeah,
was probably the real instigator, and they didn't. And it was said that Histiaeus believed that if there's a revolt, then the king might send him back to
yeah,
Ionia to put down the revolt, I guess, right? Officially speaking. So that was his ticket out, right?
yeah, yeah,
But then he got promoted.
yeah.
You could say that.
Histiaeus' story is actually an interesting one because he obviously doesn't want to remain in Susa. However, the Persians, I don't believe in the royal court. At least a decent number of Persians and the great king Darius himself, they do trust him enough to keep him on as an advisor, and they do actually send him back to Miletus during the revolts as a sort of Persian agent. So, yes, there are these suspicions about Histiaeus, and it is an interesting thing in Herodotus' account, and you'll find this in other Greek histories as well, that you'll have seemingly a very romantic, very legitimate cause, such as Ionian independence, freedom from Persia, this Ionian revolt in which all of the Ionians, so-called, speak with a common voice, and it's sort of they identify themselves as doing so. But sort of ancient Greek historians love a bit of irony, and so they'll say, I'm going to sort of unpack this event and this sort of romanticized version of the tale by saying, look at these internal intrigues done by these sort of unsavory individuals like Aristagoras and Histiaeus, and these are the sort of originators of this romantic cause. And I mean, it also happens with the story about the beginnings of Athenian democracy as well. But I intend to go on to speak a little bit more about that during our episode on Marathon, which is something to look forward to. But either way, Histiaeus' campaigns don't really gain anything for the Ionians, and so we can put Histiaeus in the shelf to talk about the final stages of the rebellion. Now, up till now, the Persians had been campaigning on the very edges of rebel territory. They had managed a few wins. However, they haven't been able to knock the rebellion out as a force. And so, once they've recovered from the Battle of Pedasus, the Persians decide that they're just going to hit the heart of the rebellion and just capture it and make an example of it. So the next target for the Persian campaign is the city of Miletus itself. They're going to capture the city and punish it, and by doing so, because it's the locus of this rebellion, it's expected that the rest of the rebel cities will then capitulate. This is the plan. So the Persians gather a massive army and also a fleet of 600 ships, and they march all the way to Miletus, besieging it by land and blockading it from the sea. The moment the Ionians realize that the Persians are going to go for Miletus, they meet at a place called the Pan-Ionion, which is this sort of religious space dedicated to the god Poseidon, near an area called Mycale, and it's a shared area by all the Ionians where they have a festival there. And so they resolve that they're not going to fight the Persians on land, because this would effectively be suicide, because the Persians have brought so many overwhelming land forces. And the last time that the Greeks fought the Persians on land at the Battle of Ephesus, they were utterly routed. and they'd most likely be sallying outside of the safety of Miletus's walls. So what they decide to do,
Miletus is quite a well fortified city.
yeah, it's Miletus at this point does have city walls, and so as most Greek polis do, apart from apparently Sparta, but we can go into that on a later episode. But Miletus is as well defended as most Greek city-states, and ancient warfare at this point in the early 5th century BC is not that technically developed.
It's either
It isn't like the
starve them out
Peloponnesian.
or
Yeah, you're most likely going to starve them out and use the 600 ships the Persians brought in to blockade and prevent any intervening force from coming in with supplies. This isn't like the Peloponnesian War. Yeah, this isn't like the Peloponnesian War where the Thebans build a flamethrower and like destroy Plataea's walls. There aren't many options in this scenario.
No, I was also going to say, or you could be like Demetrius, Antigonus,
Yeah.
and have the Heliopolis.
Yeah, and this is far before the age where Demetrius builds the Heliopolis, the mega super siege tower, which, by the way, incidentally, also didn't work, and the Rhodians end up building the Colossus of Rhodes out of its captured remains. But
almost feels like Nelson's coffin being from the flagship of the Lorient, correct?
Yeah. But the Persians, at this point, don't have many options when besieging Miletus. They can attempt to assault the walls, however, as I said, the Greeks are accurate in believing that a lot of the Persian troops are quite lightly armoured, and so they would end up suffering quite heavy casualties. Or, probably the easier option is to gather all of your soldiers, a massive enough force that creates a deterrence to prevent other cities from intervening, and to sit outside of the walls and sit outside of Miletus's harbour and just starve the city out into surrender. Because either they surrender and the Persians will be able to accept the surrender of the instigator of the revolt, thereby putting an end to it, receiving their subjugated vassal again, or they weaken the defenders to the point where they can make a successful assault and they sack the city and make an example out of it. So this is the Persian plan, basically. However, the Greek plan is to prevent the Persian naval blockade, and they gather all of the ships of Ionia, all of their warships. We've got warships coming from Samos, Miletus's major rival. The Milesians obviously have their ships. Erythrae, Phocaea also brings ships. All of the Ionians contribute triremes to this collective pan-Ionian fleet, and the sum total comes up to about 353 ships. It's a pretty major force, yeah.
And would it be fair to say, since it's the trireme, right? Like that is the predominant ship. The Carthaginians have not yet invaded the quadriremes or quinquiremes. So each ship is like what, 300 people, including the rowers?
Yeah. Each ship will be about crews of 200, as well as detachment of marines.
Yeah, so I've just broadly put 300, including everybody, and your command crew as well.
Yeah. Chances are militaries are never really operating at full crewing or capacity. So you're never going to have a full trireme, but it's best case scenario is that it's that number.
But maybe we could just, I think, reasonably guesstimate if they had been planning for this assault for 2 years after their disaster in Caria.
Yeah.
It's fair to say at least they would be theoretically we're talking about around a 300 maximum. Maybe 275, 280 types on average.
Yeah.
So still pretty well equipped.
Yeah. All of these ships are well equipped and also ready for battle. The Persians want to put an end to this rebellion that's been plaguing their western border and has been drawing in external Greek support. They want to kill it as soon as possible, but it has raged out of control for about 6 years. And all that while, for all those 6 years, the Persians are in a state of precarity, since if this area is revolting, then other areas might also think, maybe if the Persians are tied up fighting in this part of the map, I can sort of rebel and fight the Persians in my part of the map, and I might have a greater chance of success. and the Greeks, they want to defend their independence. The Ionians do not want to come back under Persian yoke again, because they know the consequences, that the Persians are going to punish them the moment Miletus falls. And thus the Ionians have a war council where they decide on what the battle plan at Miletus is going to be. And the Greeks are sort of encamped at an island by the name of Lade, which doesn't exist anymore because changes in geography and all that. But in the classical period, there is an island called Lade just off the coast of Miletus, where various generals make speeches, but the most convincing of them is a man by the name of Dionysius the Phocian, a general who brings in about 3 ships, and he makes the following speech. Our affairs, men of Ionia, stand on the edge of a razor, whether to be free men or slaves, and runaway slaves at that. If you now consent to endure hardships, you will have toil for the present time, but it will be in your power to overcome your enemies and gain freedom. But if you will be weak and disorderly, I see nothing that can save you from paying the penalty to the king for your rebellion. Believe me and entrust yourselves to me. I promise you that, if the gods deal fairly with us, either our enemies shall not meet us in battle, or if they do, they shall be utterly vanquished. He makes the following rousing speech, and the Ionians agree to give him command of the whole Greek fleet. Now, I just want to direct your attention to when he says...
Do you mind? It's kind of crazy, like how smaller contingents in Greek fleets tend to get a lot more influence.
Yeah.
Even like before Salamis, might I add.
Yeah.
And if I'm not mistaken, Lesbos, Miletus, and Chios are at least almost 70 to 75% of the entire Ionian fleet, like just from these 3 cities. So
yeah,
it's quite shocking that these guys don't get the command.
Well, yeah, this comes up, but I also want to draw people's attention to, when he says, "But if you will be weak and disorderly," this is very important to remember for what happens next. Dionysius, under his command, the Greek fleet then begin practicing collective maneuvers at sea, and Dionysius is a pretty hard disciplinarian and sort of tactical trainer. He has the Greek fleet take part in these exercises basically all day, and he doesn't even let them come back to shore in order to rest. They remain sleeping on the triremes for several days. Turns out this backfires because the reasoning and rationale that I can see for Dionysius choosing to do this is that he's showing that the Ionians are a disciplined force at sea in front of the Persians, and that the Persians will expect a fight, and this is potentially a fight that the Persians might lose, in which case the Persians will be losing 600 ships. So the Persians have brought a lot of skin in the game by bringing their entire fleet over to Miletus. Second of all, by having
one little detail though.
Yeah.
Triremes are not exactly seaworthy.
Yeah, exactly. Being on a trireme is not very fun. It's actually... There's a passage in Thucydides where he talks about an Athenian blockade on the island of Pylos. And one of the problems that the Athenians have is they're blockading these Spartans trapped on this island, and they're sort of depriving them of food and trying to weaken these Spartan defenders. However, because they're blockading it constantly at sea and they don't go on land, they are just staying on the ships. So the Athenians themselves are also running out of food. They're running out of both food and, most importantly, fresh water. Because obviously you can't drink seawater. Yeah, don't drink seawater. Very inadvisable. So what?
At least they're no seagulls.
Yeah. So if you're trapped on your trireme, having to sort of stay on it because of the needs of the campaign and sort of the commands of the general, you are absolutely suffering. Your provisions are basically everything you've kept on the trireme, which, by the way, you're going to have to ration, and it's usually going to be some barley, grain, olive oil, things that are compact and you can keep on a ship. You're also crowded with about 200 other blokes. You don't have much space to yourself. A trireme, by the way, is not a submarine. You are also exposed to the sun. Not only are you basically in this wooden tube, you are also sort of having all this exposure to the elements. And if you want an alternative to olive oil and barley and whatever dried, cured meats that you have kept on the trireme, your only other options are to fish and to sort of crab and eat crab from the sea. And it's okay having fish and crab and lobsters or not for maybe one meal out of a series of meals. However, if you're relying on them as your primary food source for several days on end, it's not great. Plus, triremes also don't have working toilets, so I mean the sea's out there, but obviously it's not very pleasant.
Well, considering even if you could consider the ships of the line of the Royal Navy in the 1800s weren't that better off. Yeah, I don't even want to imagine the quadriremes and such.
The Ionians, and there is a rationale behind keeping the Ionians at sea, because the Persians will have their ships, they'll come out, at least some of them will come out, just in case the Greeks make an attack, and then they'll come back, beach on the shore, where they have all their provisions and they're able to resupply. However, rotational problems do occur, where a Persian commander will maybe go back to shore, perhaps a bit earlier than intended, and all kinds of opportunities can arise, especially with ancient naval warfare. So if the Ionian ships are already at sea and already ready for battle, they can take advantage of any opportunities that arise if the Persians make any mistakes. And it's really important to take these opportunities because, bearing in mind, the Persians have 600 ships. They have almost double the number of ships that the Ionians have. But if they can catch them on the beach and rout them before they can take onto their ships and prepare and organize, then maybe the Ionians actually have a fighting chance. The problem is that the Ionians have been stuck on their ships for several days, having to do all these exercises in the baking hot sun, and they start getting fed up with Dionysius of Phocaea. And they become so fed up that Herodotus claims that they said the following: "Against what god have we sinned that we have to fulfill this task? We have lost our minds and launched out into folly, committing ourselves into the hands of this Phocaean braggart, who brings but 3 ships, and having got us, he afflicts us with afflictions incurable. Many of us have fallen sick already, and many are likely to suffer the same thing. Instead of these ills, it would be better for us to suffer anything and endure this coming slavery, whatever it will be, rather than be oppressed by that which is now upon us. Come, let us obey him no longer." So Herodotus claims that the position of Ionian sailors is in fact, I don't want to do this manual labor, and I don't want to do this manual labor so hard that I would rather be enslaved by Persia. Whether the Ionians...
Well, I guess maybe just being on the triremes really affected that even more.
Yeah. It's not impossible that Ionians will grumble, and people under pressure and in hardship will do and say pretty crazy things, pretty extraordinary things. I'll rephrase that. But it does sort of contribute to this impression of the Ionians, they got routed at Ephesus. Now they can't stand this military discipline, even if it's at this cost of their own independence. They could potentially, rather than doing manual labor, they could potentially rather be enslaved by the Persians. And so this just contributes to that sort of existing literary tradition of the Ionians as this problematic group of Greeks that drew the rest of the Greek world into this conflict, even though they didn't really have the capacity or the will to fight it out themselves for their own independence. And as a result but whether or not this speech actually happens, as Herodotus reports it, the Ionians return back to shore, arguably out of necessity, because you cannot stay on a trireme for several days on end without your capacity for battle being degraded quite significantly.
Or literally, like, I might also add supplies. If I'm not mistaken,
Yeah.
voyages generally were few days at the most before you had to make landfall at all costs.
Yeah. You would normally have to stick close to a coastline because you can't. There's not much storage space on a trireme, to be honest. I mean, if you visit Greece, you can actually see the Greek government rebuilt a sort of working trireme that you can actually row in.
RMN or RMS Olympias, I think that's the name of the current warship.
Yeah. I think it's either the official flagship of the modern Greek Navy, or it's one of the sort of commissioned warships. But people do have opportunities to go on and actually row it out into sea. There's actually a YouTube video of someone doing this. It's worth a look, because it does actually show that being on a trireme is not very fun, even for a few hours, let alone several days. It's at this point that some of the Greek contingents start considering that maybe the Ionian cause is a lost cause. And when the Persians had brought their forces into outside of Miletus, they had also brought several of the exiled tyrants who had formerly ruled the Ionian cities that Aristagoras had ousted. And these tyrants, prior to the battle, had been sort of making approaches to these Ionian commanders and crews, saying, "Oh, if you welcome me back, the Persian king will sort of have leniency on you. If you can betray the Ionian cause, you'll be safe, you'll be fine." However, because the Ionians were resolute in deciding that they were going to fight the Persians, they had initially rebuffed the approaches of these tyrants. No more. Once all the Greek ships come back to shore and they realize that playing the long game, they also suffer just as much as the Persians, some of the Greeks end up considering defecting back to Persia, namely the Samians. And it's not a coincidence that it's Samos, because Samos is the primary rival of Miletus. The Samians and the Milesians hate each other so much that even under the Athenian Empire, they actually fight a war, even though they're both members of the Delian League.
Well, I guess some things can never change.
Indeed. And so the Samians then agree to betray the Ionians and defect over to Persia, or at least a significant number of their commanders agree to this. So when the Greeks decide to put out to sea and seek an open battle with the Persian fleet, the Samians form one of the wings, and on the other end of the battlefield are the Milesians, and the rest of the Greeks are in between. And the Samians end up, just before the battle begins, some of the Samians turn their ships around and sail home. This basically spells the doom of the
Can
Greek
I also add
fleet.
that this is like 1/6 of the Allied fleet, because according to Herodotus, they sent 60 ships on almost 360, so that's almost 16% of the entire force. Just like all right, guys, I'll take my leave. Good luck.
A lot of them sail home. However, Herodotus does make a note of the fact that some of the Samian captains actually remain loyal to the Ionian cause and stand and fight. And he also makes mention, he loves doing this, where he'll talk about some artifact or some monument in a Greek city that he's personally seen that's still standing to his day. And the Samians, after the Persian Wars, actually honor the names of these captains in their agora as a sort of tribute of Samian military valor, even though the majority of them ran away.
Okay, that's interesting.
But at this point, there's a massive hole on the Greek flank, and even though the remaining Samians fight bravely, it's for naught. The Persians just overwhelm them. And Herodotus has a very interesting way of describing the battle. He says that, "I can't tell you which Ionian contingent actually fought well and which didn't, because all of the Ionians blame each other. However,
May I just add this one thing? It kind of feels
Yeah.
like, France in the summer of 1940 with the different political factions blaming each other.
yeah, it's pretty typical. Even even at the Battle of Salamis, the Greeks also blame each other, and they actually win the Battle of Salamis. Spoilers, by the way. So, and they're still blaming each other. So, like the Athenians are blaming the Corinthians, and they're not giving enough credit to the Aeginetans because they're taking all the credit as the Athenians. But infighting and factionalism is basically the norm for the Greek city-states. Now, of special note are actually the force from Chios, which is another island like Samos. It's a pretty big island in Ionia, and the Chian contingent actually fight hard against the Persians. They put up a strong fight, however, even they end up being overwhelmed and having to retreat. However, the Chians have extremely bad luck because the Chians, as they're sailing away, they make a pit stop at Ephesus because it's considered a safe city, basically. They can get inside the walls and rest up, take up supplies. However, they reached Ephesus, the sort of area outside of Ephesus, during a religious festival. And so the Ephesians see all of these armed Greeks and not knowing that they're actually allies, they actually think they're bandits coming to attack their women taking part in a festival called the Thesmophoria. And so the Ephesians actually end up killing their own allies, the Chians, the moment they rock up looking for shelter, having fought very bravely in the battle.
Can I just say, Greek festivities do lead to quite big military tragedies. See to Syracuse and Point.
Indeed. However, with the destruction of the Greek fleet, the Ionian Revolt is effectively over. There's nothing to stop the Persians from taking the city of Miletus, and once Miletus falls, so does the rebellion. Because at this point, it's transparently clear, for all the talk of the Ionians speaking with a common voice, for all them meeting and deciding collectively at the Pan-Ionian to fight the Persians and protect their independence, each interest of the Greek city-states, namely Samos, you can blame Samos for this one actually, rather than Miletus, each of the interests of the individual city-states is no longer aligned. The Samians have abandoned the cause, and now each of the Greek city-states now has to look to defend itself or to cut a deal with the Persians. And thus concludes the Ionian revolts. Miletus ends up getting sacked, and the Athenian playwright Phrynichus actually produces a tragedy called The Fall of Miletus, depicting the destruction of the city, and it angers the Athenians so much that they actually issue a fine punishing him for producing this play, and also they forbid this script from ever being reproduced.
But it got reproduced, I guess. That's why we know of it.
Well, it's a significant event in Athenian sort of cultural history. So people did make a record of it, and the fact that it caused such a response that the playwright was fined and that the play was forbidden to be put on in the future. But yes, so concludes the Ionian Revolt. And Athens, by the way, is still at war with Persia. And I didn't mention this during our discussion on the Battle of Ephesus, but when the city went up in flames, the flames also consumed the temple of an Anatolian goddess by the name of Cybele. I've definitely butchered that pronunciation, but the Greeks ended up burning down a temple, and this becomes a justification of war for which the Persians and Darius blame the Athenians, or so the story goes. They blame the Athenians and in addition, the Eretrians. So,
And that draws the
although
attention of the Persian Empire to mainland Greece.
So this is
finally.
the door being open, and they have like the justification to the masses.
Yeah.
So I think I have one question though. What was the response of the satrapy to the now subdued Ionian cities?
The Ionian cities end up facing widespread destruction. I mean, the population of Miletus ends up getting deported into Mesopotamia, and the archaeological record actually shows quite a lot of destruction debris in these city sites. So the Persians do punish the Ionians very severely, to the extent where during the classical period under the Athenian Empire, there's a massive drop in Ionian influence, to the point where, you know how the Ionians managed to field 350 ships in this period?
Yeah.
They don't field that many during the later 5th century. It does have a tangible impact.
Like, we're talking about like their numbers go around like what, 50, 60 types?
Yeah, I don't have the exact figure, but Ionia sort of becomes this sort of provincial territory of both the Persians and the Athenians. When it revolts and the Athenians are in a weak spot, they are a proper thorn in the Athenians' side. The city of Samos and the cities of Samos and Chios are still able to sort of fight a degraded Athenian fleet alongside Spartans. However, this isn't a situation where the Athenians contribute 20 ships and the Ionians have 350.
All right. We don't want to give too much away as to what draws the Persian Empire to make a detour against mainland Greece. But I guess overall, what would you say is the most significant? What is so significant about the revolt in the grand scheme of things, given the wars that are to come?
Well, I actually have a bit of a vested interest in the region because my undergraduate dissertation actually wrote about Ionian cities in rebellion against Athens, not against Persia, but thinking about the Ionian cities as an independent bloc that's able to exert power and influence and also fight battles against invading forces. But the Ionian revolt really sort of, it draws Persia's attention to cities in mainland Greece because of the burning down of Sardis and the destruction of the temple. It creates that grievance that Darius has when a servant will sort of whisper in his ear, "Sire, remember the Athenians," before he has his dinner.
Almost feels like Cato the Elder and his obsession with Carthage in a way. Actually, it's pretty much the same thing.
It's very similar, and maybe the veracity of the story can't be confirmed because obviously the Athenians love being the center of attention. Of course the Persians invade Greece because of them, because they want to subdue Athens especially. By the way, it's not their fault that the Persians invade mainland Greece. It's actually Miletus' fault for drawing Athens into a conflict. But yeah, this is sort of the first major open conflict between independent Greeks and Persia. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we can end it off there. So we teased a little bit about the future episode. I think it's very interesting for the audience because I know the majority of regular people probably have heard of the Battle of Marathon, Battle of Thermopylae, and such, but I don't think they're so knowledgeable about where this all started. And again, a big thanks to you, Dan. You've done an excellent job going through this entire thing. And I didn't mention this at the beginning of the episode, but for those of you who are listening on audio podcast platforms, of course, if you go over to the YouTube channel, we had shown a lot of maps and some depictions of the events, like the burning of the city of Sardis. And before I let everybody go, again, if you'd like to further support the channel, consider checking out the YouTube membership or the Patreon account over at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War channel, where we have an exclusive podcast series, early access to a lot of the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Big thanks to the both of you, and I'm excited to go through the next stage of this.
I think the next few episodes are going to be talking about the famous battles of the Greco-Persian Wars. A lot of heroes coming our way.
Yep, absolutely. The Athenians are going to love these episodes. They love being the heroes of the Greek world, the center of attention.
All right. Till next time.